Welcome to Conversations with the Authors.
Welcome back to Conversations with the Authors. I'm your host, Daniel.
And I'm Daryl.
And I'm Sandra.
And today we're talking about sort of different styles of writing and how it compares or contrasts, I suppose, to creative writing in terms of science fiction fantasy. Now, as always, this is an unscripted episode. So we're just sort of going off the dome and just having a conversation like we usually do. Before we start, let me thank Alexander Nakarada for the intro. As always, thank you so much. Always enjoyable. Okay, so we're going to talk about styles of writing. Today, particularly because you guys wrote this highly rated, award-nominated fantasy sci-fi novel, How Nicholas Became Santa Claus. It is a narrative in its core. And a narrative simply...
Well, I think it has some mixtures of various things. Mm-hmm. And I wouldn't necessarily call it a narrative, but there is narration, right, obviously, but it's creative writing.
Right. Right.
Okay.
So, it's storytelling, right?
Right.
And of course, in storytelling, we have descriptive writing. And descriptive writing varies depending on the style, quote unquote. You couldn't see my fingers, but I did the whole thing, of writing you're doing. Mm-hmm. For instance, Dad, you're a physician.
Right.
So your writing is not, when you're at work, it's not narrative writing. It's... No. It's very technical. It's
actually, in very many ways, it's academic.
Yes, academic.
Because I'm teaching, and right, I may write something for my students to read, my medical students, or I may want to relay facts in a certain way.
Right.
And so the standard way to do that is to write it in a very professional style. Academic writing might suffice with that. And I have a son who's at one time was in and you even in chefery,
right?
In doing that, it may be very technical,
right? Because Ma, that when we write recipes, whether you're writing recipes as Mom writing a recipe, or I'm writing recipes as Dan the chef, mm-hmm, our recipe writing is instructional, so it's very sort of to the point. It's concise. And it has to be very specific to what we're talking about. So right, generally, unless I'm, making a fanciful sort of cookbook, you're not going to see sort of narrative descriptions, mm-hmm, and sort of fanciful, mm-hmm, things like that. You're going to see start the oven at 350, put the cake in, let it go for 45 minutes to an hour. Pull it out. It's going to be very specific.
And right, certainly, in getting advanced degrees too, people that write for their master's degree, right, or their PhD, they write something academic and very, very professional. So all through our world, there's writing everywhere. There's writing on street signs. There's writing on tickets that people get. There's writing in recipe books. There's mm-hmm, writing in stories that people read. Right. There's scientific writing. There is writing on astronomy and physics, right, and mathematics and all these other things.
And the most common one is store-bought labels.
Right.
Store-bought labels, yeah, insurance policies. We right, touched on that a little bit last time when we were talking about various types of writing, and that you have to know what your audience is, who you're writing to, and what you want to relate to someone.
Right.
Because obviously, if you're trying to write a story for entertainment purposes, you
right,
don't want it to sound
right,
like an insurance policy.
So when you wrote How Nicholas Became Santa Claus, you have a lot of different characters and creatures, mm-hmm, in your stories that have many different professions.
Right.
But if you're writing for the doctor, who happens to be in the story, or the wizard who happens to be in the story, you're not going to write in a professional, technical manner with all the technical jargon, right?
No. It's always going to be a creative writing approach when you're writing a story.
Right.
Of course, you might be writing a professor about
right,
a professor
mm-hmm,
who's getting ready to tell you, right, or lecturing to you,
mm-hmm,
how the asteroid is on his
right,
way. Now, within the story,
right,
inside of the story, he may speak to his students and his audience in a very technical way. So I have some familiarity with the way that type of speech and writing works.
Right.
But by far, you're writing a creative story.
Right.
So that's within the story, in the character. And don't get that confused.
And of course, like you said, it's in
Right.
the character.
Right.
And so that sort of lingo, that description that these characters, the physician, the professor, the wizard, are using, these are, it's almost like costume, It's just to sort of just remind you a little bit that this is what this guy does. But in the grand scheme of the story, we're not going to be worrying about his lecture notes. We're not going to be worrying about his, physician's journal.
Right.
That would, if you wrote it any other way, I think that's a way to kill a story.
Yeah, I think so.
A
yeah.
good way to look at it is as set decoration.
If anyone remembers, has anyone ever seen a movie or a story that has to do with a trial?
Yeah.
They use realistic language and to relate the story of a trial going on. The lawyers sound like lawyers, the judges sound like judges.
Yes.
And so to have some familiarity
Right.
with that type of writing and the way they should sound is apt, something you
Right.
need for your story. But that's just for story purposes,
Right.
and that is within the story,
Right.
within this creative writing that you're doing. So
Right. For instance, the movie Burn, and though I've only seen trailers for it, you have sort of this, what it appears to be this sort of pompous chef who, is sort of into what he does, and you see him in his environment, and speaking and doing as you might expect a high caliber chef to do. But that is not the overall story.
Right.
That is not, as you say, what drives the story. What drives the story is the narrative. It's the storyline. It's the plot. It's the characters.
you may have certain interests that you want to write about. You may have certain interests you want your characters to care about.
Right.
But don't give a dissertation.
Yes.
And don't go long-winded on some esoteric point, that takes you away from your story just because you know a lot about it and you're very interested in it. And that's a fine thing.
And when you wrote characters like that in your story, did you ever look at the dialogue and go, that might be a little too much. Maybe I need to pull back on that?
Yeah,
we've
done
actually
that.
we've done that. We've thrown out entire chapters of stuff where we said no.
We had a character, one of the speaking wizards in there, who got a little bit long-winded, and I told my wife, I said, you know what, we're going to cut this because this guy's talking too much.
Right.
It reminds you a little bit, if you've ever seen the old Star Trek.
Yeah.
When Spock is trying to explain something to Captain Kirk and he goes on and Captain will cut him off.
Yes, yeah.
Because he's getting more technical than he needs to be. Well, sometimes, that's done on purpose, but don't do that by accident and just deaden your story and make people roll their eyes and say, when is this going to quit?
So how do you look at that sort of scenario and decide whether this drives the story? How do you decide? Do you also think, is this going to resonate, or do you feel like, oh, okay, you're losing me?
When you're writing it and you're reading it to yourself, and if you're saying to yourself, gee, you think this is getting a little long? Yeah, it's gotten a little long.
Yeah, if you think it's gotten long, it's probably has gotten long.
It's the old Wallyism, If you have to ask the question, you've already got the answer.
Well, and so
Wally being your father. Of course.
Put yourself inside of your character's skin. Be an actor in your own story. Talk to the people in your story as one of the characters, and it puts you in that environment, and when you're going too short or when you're going even worse, too long on a conversation. And you want to get it just right. So, I've had periods where I'm writing, and somebody comes into the room and says, "Well, what's wrong, Dad?" Because they see me making faces, doing hand gestures, or I'm saying things, and so I tell them I'm writing and I'm acting at the same time because I want to get a good feel for what I need to say and how I need to say it and how long I need to say it.
Right.
Okay.
You know, and we talked about how sort of as the writer of your story, you're the deity, right? You create the rules.
You're the puppet master.
You're the puppet master, and that's sort of where the emphasis on expository nature comes in. Like, this is where you establish the rules, you've established how the world works, and I think after that you sort of need to move on and get into the story.
Exactly.
Yeah. And so, and make no mistake, you know, each type of writing has its place.
Right.
So you just don't want to write a story within the wrong technique. Expository writing, as you mentioned there, is really when you're trying to explain certain concepts or provide an analysis of a topic or an object in an informational manner. They frequently use it in essays, in textbooks, news articles, and reports, and that type of thing. You know, unless you're writing something like that,
Right.
then you want to be sure that you have the right style. If you're writing creative writing, do that.
Right.
You know, don't pontificate and go dancing off into the stratosphere because it's something that you're interested in. And it's fine that you're interested in this, but you want to keep your audience interested
Right.
also, and not bore them. That's probably the worst thing you do.
So when you're creating a scene in your story, when you're creating a chapter, when you're creating, let's say, a war, right? And Nan Nicholas has a lot of war in it.
Yeah.
There's a lot of action and just everything happening everywhere. But there's an order to what could be seen as chaos sometimes, because you guys did a magnificent job of constructing this story from beginning to end. It's a page turner. How do you look at the construction of a scene, of a chapter in your book? Do you write the event first, like, okay, there's a big war and this person dies, or there's a big war and that gets stolen, or how do you think about what happens first, or do you write what leads up to it first?
And the outline said this has to happen, so we had to figure out how to make that happen.
But the sequence and the timing of how that happens, and that it happens 95% of the time, depends on what goes on in the story. And you keep your focus on your characters. If your characters are in a physical fight, keep focus on that, and know where you're having a general idea where you're supposed to go with that.
But as
it
you
generally
say,
works out. Sometimes you find something better.
And as you
I
said
found
before,
usually by the time we got to a war scene, the story was writing itself.
and right. So
agree.
as you were saying before in some of our previous podcasts, in order to create such a successful story and worthy of the nomination it received, the Eric Hoffer Award,
Yes.
Was the nominee, yes.
you have to allow the scenes to run organically, right? You write the dialogue, you let the action happen, and you just sort of keep writing until...
Sometimes the hardest part was to have a character that I did not like
Yes.
do what he needed to do.
Well, you know, when you're writing a story, just like you said, the puppet master, the deity, you're imbuing your character with life.
Right.
And there are certain things that are going to happen naturally in a living character. The things that they do, the things they say, where they go, and how they survive. There's a natural unfolding of the story. And so I think you let that happen. You allow that to happen.
Right.
You can't have something going in a certain direction and it's strongly going in a direction, and then suddenly you force it into another direction. People can see that force.
Yes, yeah.
You know, unless
It's sort of like jumping the shark, right?
Yeah,
Right.
unless you've intended to do that for some literary reason or for some general reason. You know, maybe it's a horror, or there's magic, or there's something like that. But generally, things will follow a natural course.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
You'll literally feel, when you're writing it that it's not taking the right turn.
And with, an organic story, I imagine that the characters themselves sort of develop organically.
Yes, they do.
And so when you develop, let's say, young Nicholas, what's the first thing you think of when you develop a character? When you say, let's write a story, let's create a character, what's the first thing you think of? Do you think of the plot? Do you think of the character themselves? Do you think of who the character is? Or
Well, in this case, I wanted to write a story about Nicholas. Not yet having the title
The Mantle,
of the Mantle, and how he got there, and how did he grow up so that he had those values that
Right.
he carried into the Mantle
Right.
title. And in order to do that, he had to grow up. So how do you make him grow up? Well, first he's got to be a kid.
Right. Okay, so Daryl, you're working on a sequel story.
Right.
When you're creating your characters for this new story, which I can't wait to find out about, how do you say, okay, this is going to be our main character, and this is who he or she is?
Well,
What's the first thing you do? Do you come up with a name?
Well, you got to have an idea,
Okay.
and this is good advice, I think, for writers out there. You have an idea, and you have to put your character in a situation. Your character has to grow and change, and so your character is going to become. He's going to become good. He's going to become bad. He's going to become neutral, but he's going to change somehow, and so that's going to happen. So you take this thing and you outline it.
Right.
And you outline the story from the beginning to the end. When you get finished outlining, you're going to know how the story ends. Possibly,
Right.
And because you know how it's probably going to begin. And I use those words, those indefinite terms like that, because sometimes it does change.
But right, like as you said, if you're writing the story properly, it should be organic. The story should sort of, in a sense, write itself, and you're sort of edging it along. You sort of put this child into the world, and you're watching it develop as the story progresses.
Your protagonist is going to have a mission. There's something that the protagonist wants. There's something they need to pursue, and he's going to grow along in that pursuit. And there's somebody or something out there that does not want him to do that, and who's opposite him, and
Right.
that's your antagonist. And you're always going to have that duo.
There's always someone.
There's
in opposition,
always a
yes.
duo. There's the antagonist and there's the protagonist.
Right.
Always, I used to ask a question when I was a kid. I used to ask my mother. I said, "Why do we need to have the bad guy? Why can't it just be good?" Well, because you don't have a story. That's why.
Because roll credits. That's why.
That's not right. Exactly. That's not how it works.
So before the podcast ends in just a moment, I want to ask you both, individually or together if you like, what is your biggest challenge when writing a story, either personally, either together or separately, and how do you feel that you overcame that?
I think I mentioned, I kind of touched that a little before, that you write something that you're interested in, and the biggest challenge is to make sure, to write it in a way that is interesting to other people.
Yes.
Yes. Because you can write the most exciting story, or you can write the most boring story.
Right.
And that's a crime not to bore someone. You want to make sure that you hit that sweet spot where it's something you're interested in, and you've made it interesting to someone else too. You agree, Sandra?
I agree. And for me, it was not being redundant. I would, because of the dyslexia, I would forget that I had written part of this. So before I wrote anything the next day, I had to go back and read everything that I read or had written the day before.
But to be certain, I also followed up behind too.
Yeah.
And
That was the other
so,
thing.
I mean, we can talk about, and maybe we will. We'll talk about plot holes and redundancies and things that might get left out that interfere with the consistency of the
Yes.
story.
Yeah.
So we made sure that we had this ironed out pretty smooth,
Right.
before we finish the story. I guess that's what happens when you read a story, more than 15 times. You just
Absolutely,
make sure that it's straight.
And I remember I was trying to write one scene, and then I go, wait a minute. I haven't seen this character in... What did I do with it?
Right.
Yeah, so
So, ladies and gentlemen, dear readers and listeners, if you want a story that's nice and ironed out, if you want a story that hits the sweet spot, you can visit us at troopbooks.com, where you can land on the author page and pick up a hardcover or a soft cover of the book. You can visit our social media at facebook.com at troopbooks, TROUPE. You can visit our Instagram, our TikTok, our Threads, Mr. Zuckerberg, and we will talk to you next time on Conversations with the Authors.